Good morning. My name is Justice Nonvignon. I am Technical Director for Health Economics and Financing at the Management Sciences for Health, also a Professor of Health Economics at the University of Ghana. Next, I will be asking some questions around whether or not we can afford, on a whole, to achieve malaria eradication in our lifetime. Imagine for a moment a world without malaria, and ask yourself what that would mean for a child in my village, for a mother, for other caregivers, in terms of how much more time they could save to be more productive at work. What it would mean for firms and companies if they had staff spending more time in production. What it would mean for a country. But this comes at a cost. And so the question is, how much do we need to achieve such a world? And what impacts, besides the health impacts that we have a lot more people living, what other impacts can we communicate to policymakers to help us achieve such a world? The promise for financing of malaria has been long in coming, but of course we've seen a lot of progress since 2000. And here I only attempt to indicate some of the major milestones that have driven up financing for malaria, right up from the MDGs through the SGDs, also with the various global health initiatives that have come on board, bearing in mind that countries themselves have also put in a bit more resources compared to the pre-2000s. And the impact is that we've seen significant reduction in mortality. We've seen reductions in morbidity, but not where we would want to be. However, the events of not just this year, but the past couple of years around the uncertainty on the global health financing landscape, we've seen cuts in bilateral aid. We've also seen the impact of these and other evolving issues on the ability of global health initiatives, such as the Global Fund, Gavi, WHO, and the others, the ability to continue with the work they do, the critical work they do into the future. We also know that getting countries to increase their own financing is not simply calling them to do so, but also assessing what the environment is for them. And in these countries in Africa, mainly that are high burden countries, they also face various fiscal constraints, low tax revenue as a percent of GDP versus high debt burden, among other constraints. And so the key thing that comes to mind is whether the promise of financing malaria from all perspectives is a cloud or a rain. A cloud is different from a rain because a cloud may never become rain. We want this to be rain and not a cloud. The other question that the significant work that we've done, especially since 2000s around financing malaria, raises is whether or not we have moved towards a world where countries depend more on aid for malaria, or we have carried countries along, getting them to also increase financing. If you look at this work, that is a result of a modeling done by other people. Right here. Okay, this one does not have a pointer. Anyway, so the upper part, you see the pie for, so this pie represents, development assistance for malaria specifically, financing of malaria. You see how that has grown over the years. And you see how the pie or the contribution from countries have over the years shrunk. This is specifically financing malaria. But we also see other sources that are really private sources. in many countries we see that private sources, especially out-of-pocket payments, constitute the largest portion. If you go to Nigeria, more than 70% of financing comes out of pocket. And that is not something we want to see. So there are questions there for us to ask, how far we have carried countries when it comes to financing of malaria and gotten them to take a lot more of the responsibility. So, going back to this question, can we afford malaria eradication? Here, I did nothing new except to revisit excellent work done by Edith and co. to estimate the costs in terms of resource requirements for achieving the GTS targets. These estimates were generated in 2015, looking 15 years forward, so 2015 to 2030. And, gave us estimates that we need a little over $100 billion through 2030 to achieve the GTS targets, which are near eradication of malaria. Of course, 88% of these costs will need to go into the top 20 high-burning countries, most of which are Africa. Now, what I did was to convert these, costs into 2015 estimates, and these will translate to $139 billion. So, assuming, without admitting, that we actually had generated a lot of these before, and we only had a 5-year cost between now and 2030, we need something around 60 billion. But even assuming that we had not managed to raise $1 of the 100 billion, and that between now and 2030 we need $100 billion to eradicate malaria, is this something we can afford? And so that brings me to the other part of the conversation, because the question of whether or not we can afford also doesn't end at what will it cost us, but what could it benefit us? And here, in the next couple of slides, I share recent report released by the Malaria No More UK and the African Leaders Malaria Alliance, based on an economic model that my team at Management Sciences for Health developed, looking forward to what the macro impact, of malaria, different scenarios of malaria response would bring to countries. And this report is available for details. We looked at various scenarios. One scenario which is achieving the GTS targets. And of course, there are other scenarios basically modeled around how much the Global Fund is able to generate or is able to generate to support its work. Here, I wanted to focus on this green part. So our model shows that by 2030, in other words, if we are able to generate the 100 billion that we need, 100 plus billions that we need, and move that into malaria control and towards eradication, we will not only be saving a lot of lives, but we will be generating economic benefits in terms of the gross domestic products to countries, which is what the ministries of finance think more about, in excess of $230 billion. So again, I wanted to reflect on the 100 plus billions of dollars we need in costs and compare that to the 200 plus billions of dollars we will generate between now and 2030 only. Our model shows that if you actually project this into 2040, then these countries, and this is Africa alone, these countries will generate economic benefits beyond $2.5 trillion for achieving the GTS targets of malaria. Of course, the other scenarios you see here are basically scenarios of not achieving that. What happens to GDP or gross domestic product or an economic output if we don't achieve that, if we cut prevention we're going to drop in the GDP for these countries. What we did was to model this for 8 high burden countries in Africa and see what specifically we have this, of course, for all countries in Africa, but we focus on the 8 high burden countries. Look at Nigeria. Nigeria stands to gain by 2030 $46 billion. And this is only in the gross domestic product. There are other aspects of the economy that we modeled. We also modeled impact on education outcomes, the future earnings of children. We modeled this on agric output and the like. And the report actually shows a bit more detail of this. Malaria eradication does not only come as a benefit to African countries. It also has direct benefits to donor countries. And what we did here is to estimate the potential impact in terms of trade, what malaria eradication would mean in boosting trade between Africa and the G7, both bilateral trade between country and, between African countries and countries in the G7, but also Africa to the whole of G7. And this tells us that by 2030, in a matter of 5 years, the G7 stands to gain in excess of $10 billion because, people are healthier within African countries and can produce more, can export more, for which the G7 benefits directly. If we extend this to 2040, we are looking at in excess of $100 billion. So, let's revisit the question of can we or can we not achieve malaria eradication? From the economic perspective, yes, we can. Can we afford? Yes, we can. Can we afford not to achieve malaria eradication? No, we cannot. Because the benefits of eradicating malaria in terms of direct productivity to the economies of countries far outweighs any costs that one can put in. But can we afford to add and add and add a growing list of interventions to countries and get the countries to finance this? Imagine for a moment again that we are in 2043, anywhere beyond 2040. We know that the Gates Foundation, at least as we've learned, would be getting ready to sunset. Imagine also that the GHIs, the Global Fund, the Gavis have either sunsetted or are getting ready to sunset. And the promise of domestic financing for malaria is still a cloud and not a rain. How would the future feeling of malaria eradication be? We sure must grow the list of interventions, and we're talking about R&D tools. But when we grow this, and we're communicating this to countries, we need to help countries prioritize. I have spoken in my previous role, with Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, with ministers of finance who ask me, you guys keep bringing new tools on the market every day, and you ask us to pick it on, and we keep growing the lists. But which of those should we really focus on? Because the bucket cannot take care of all of us. So we need to optimize, we need to prioritize, we need to help countries implement, the most effective and cost-effective of these tools. The truth is, whether we like it or not, in the short to medium term, unlocking efficiency gains, which is being more efficient in what interventions we implement, would actually unlock more financing for malaria and not increasing domestic budgets, given all the constraints that are happening. So we need to work around this. There are no shortcuts. These are two African proverbs. There are no shortcuts to the top of the palm tree. And he who does not seize today's opportunity will be unable to seize tomorrow's opportunity. This is my last slide. I can conclusively say, having worked on malaria all my life as a health economist, that it is economically viable to eradicate malaria. But we need to focus, we need to do a couple of things. We need to be resilient, we need partnerships, we need to focus on the goal, but we also need to help countries prioritize and be more efficient in which interventions help achieve this goal. Thank you very much.